Jane's short reign as Queen was over. With Mary now proclaimed Queen of England, France and Ireland, Lady Jane Grey was once again merely a member of the nobility and a prisoner of the dreaded Tower of London. Separated from her parents and cast down from the throne, Jane was about to become something other than a confident teenager or a sudden queen. She was about to become a legend amongst the Protestants of England. After she had officially renounced her queenship, Jane, her husband Guildford and her mother-in-law the Duchess of Northumberland were the only people left in the royal apartments of the Tower. The guards who not so long ago had been there to serve Jane were now her jailers, taking the opportunity to mock them. Even her ladies-in-waiting had left when they were able. Her mother and father had already left the Tower as well, to do what they could to save their daughter. Jane, Guildford and the Duchess of Northumberland retreated into an inner chamber of the Tower, no longer permitted to remain in the royal apartments. Soon Mary would arrive to prepare for her coronation and would have need of them herself. The guards arrived to remove the prisoners to different places within the Tower instead. Guildford was taken to the 13th century Beauchamp Tower, an imposing structure built with thick stone, while Jane was taken to a house on Tower Green, belonging to one of the jailers, Nathaniel Partridge. Jane was now stripped of anyone familiar, with only Partridge and 3 ladies assigned to her for company. Her own ladies-in-waiting were now all outside the Tower, having fled a punishment for being by Jane's side. The public outside now knew Jane and Guildford were prisoners in the Tower, and they were soon to be joined by Jane's father-in-law, the Duke of Northumberland. In less than a fortnight, she had gone from being a young noblewoman to a queen to a prisoner. Her head must have been spinning. All she could do now was wait, helplessly, to see if fate might show her some mercy. Ironically, over at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, Mary was still unaware that she had been proclaimed Queen in London and was still raising troops to fight for her crown. On the evening of the 20th, 2 men from the Privy Council arrived unexpectedly in the courtyard of the castle with the news Mary had been waiting for. One was Sir William Paget, and the other was Henry Fitzalan, Jane's uncle, the Earl of Arundel. Just a few weeks before, they had sworn their allegiance to Queen Jane, but now they abandoned all association with the oath, instead kneeling and proclaiming Mary their queen. Now that Jane's reign was at an end, the foremost concern was saving their own heads. They begged Mary for forgiveness, but Mary was merciful in her moment of triumph, and the 2 men were pardoned graciously. Her kingdom had been won without a war breaking out, and soon after, many other nobles followed suit. They were all granted mercy by Mary, who first arranged for her chaplains to give thanks to God, who she saw as the instigator of her triumph. It was clear that, like Jane, but on opposing sides, Mary's faith was as much her rock in times of trouble as it was for her younger cousin now locked in the Tower. On the 24th of July, Queen Mary, as she was now known, set off for London. Whatever opinions were of Mary, she had waited a long time for her rightful inheritance. Now, at the age of 37, she couldn't hope to compete with the youthfulness of Jane. While she was loved and adored by the people of her country, some of the chroniclers describing her didn't hold back. One stated that she was of low rather than middling stature, with her family's auburn hair, and another stated that her voice was rough and loud, almost like a man's, so that when she speaks she is always heard a long way off. This, of course, could be seen as a very great quality for a woman who was about to be queen in her own right, but the anxiety of misogynists was never far behind the description of a woman who would rule. However, another witness also said Mary showed herself to have been born of truly royal lineage. In other words, there was no mistaking this contender to the throne unlike Jane, now viewed as a usurper. The Duke of Northumberland had been apprehended by his former ally and Jane's uncle, the Earl of Arundel. He was arrested. Their destination was clear, and on the 25th of July, they arrived in London with a guard of around 3,000 to make their way to the Tower. The crowds were looking for blood when they heard Northumberland was on his way. So much so that Arundel asked Northumberland to remove his famous red cloak and cover his face in order to not be recognised. They were still met with a barrage of rocks, stones and insults hurled in equal measure. The Duke of Northumberland's younger son, Henry, who was only 16, couldn't hold back his tears. But at the same moment, another boy about the same age burst through the crowd and ran up and down the road brandishing a sword and yelling. The boy had no ears. The same Gilbert Potter who had been mutilated early in Jane's reign for proclaiming Mary the true Queen. No doubt, he would now be an ardent supporter of Queen Mary for the rest of her life. While the arrival of the males from the Dudley family would have added to Jane's worries about her own fate, it's likely her father's incarceration in the Tower on the 27th of July was more distressing. Only her mother remained now to try and save the lives of her family, and Francis Grey immediately set off to meet with Mary at Beaulieu, arriving at 2 in the morning on the 29th of July. It was no doubt a nerve-wracking night of waiting for the morning with little sleep, but Francis and Mary had long been close. They were cousins, close in age, who had spent much of their childhood together. And many years before, when Henry VIII had been considering how to end his marriage with Mary's mother, Katherine of Aragon, it was Francis who had petitioned her uncle not to abandon his wife. After her prayers, Mary met with Francis, who begged forgiveness for her family and placed the blame squarely on Northumberland. The illness of Jane's father, Henry Grey, who had been so ill he hadn't been able to lead an army to capture Mary, was put down to poisoning by the Duke of Northumberland. This fed into a rumour flying around that Northumberland had poisoned Edward VI as well. Francis further claimed he would then have crowned Guildford as king alongside Jane, with the protecting influence of her father gone, or even have placed the young Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. While some exaggeration could be understood in the circumstances, Francis pushed it to the limit. The truth, of course, was that Jane had sent an army after Mary and signed documents declaring both Elizabeth and Mary illegitimate. Jane had made her own decisions very firmly, but they had been on the honest belief that it was the late king's wishes and that she was the rightful queen to maintain Protestantism. However, Mary was known to be a forgiving person, and no doubt she remembered how Francis had tried to help her mother. Jane, after all, was family. Although she wished to pardon both Jane and Henry Grey, the Spanish ambassadors from her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, were horrified and convinced her that Jane, at least, should stay in the Tower to prevent scandal and danger. Henry Grey, however, was pardoned the next day, but he remained in the Tower for another 2 weeks, recovering from his illness. The fear he might be close to death was equalled only by the family's fear for Jane. Far from being pardoned, she was charged with treason, a sentence that carried death by execution. At the time, being charged with treason did not mean a fair trial would be carried out, but that someone had already been proclaimed guilty, and the trial was a message to the public of Jane's wickedness. On the 3rd of August, Queen Mary finally made her triumphal entrance into London, dressed in a violet velvet dress, the sleeves and skirts embroidered with gold thread. It was a tremendous occasion, the public cheering on their new queen as she was greeted on her way to the Tower of London. It couldn't have been more different to Jane's journey to the Tower. One of the first tasks ahead of her was to oversee the burial of her brother, Edward. Through the events of the last 2 weeks, Edward still lay unburied in state at Westminster. On the 8th of August, his body was finally laid to rest. Mary wanted a full Catholic mass said for him, presumably to ensure he was covered on all fronts in the next life, but those around her advised it would be better to say mass for his soul in private instead, while his public Protestant funeral went ahead. At this point, Mary doesn't seem to have been as zealous about how her subjects worshipped as she was later. A few days later, she issued a proclamation settling the matter of religion as by common consent. For now, saying people should worship the religion they thought best. This could be best translated as, you can be Protestant for now, but quietly. Although Mary was now going to stay at the royal apartments for a while, Jane was unable to have a personal audience with her. She turned her considerable skill with words into action instead, writing a letter to her mother's cousin. The original letter doesn't survive, but at least 2 accounts state that Jane was deeply remorseful, asking her forgiveness in her unwise decision to, as she put it, listen to those around her who told her to wear the crown. It was a smart letter, whatever the outcome. Jane was able to completely give a heartfelt confession for her actions in taking the crown, but equally, she was careful to remind that others, in much higher positions than herself, had orchestrated everything. She also stressed how she had never sought out the crown for herself, which would seem to be true. She even stated that Guildford and his mother had treated her badly, perhaps a hint that she feared what they might do if she didn't comply. There was no love lost between her young husband and herself, it would seem. She even repeated her mother's claims of poison, saying that she herself had been poisoned twice, once making her hair fall out. Although the truth of this is unknown, as Northumberland would surely have needed her alive. Nevertheless, it added to his guilt. The next big event for London was the trial of John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. The biggest irony of this trial was that most of the judges had also signed the oath stating Jane should be queen. His main argument was that he had done nothing without their agreement and under the great seal of Jane, to which they argued the seal of a usurper was worthless. The evidence against Northumberland was damning, and he had been caught on the wrong side of the events. The verdict was treason, and he was sentenced to die. The usual death for a traitor would be to be hanged, drawn and quartered, and Northumberland begged Mary to allow him the privilege of a beheading and to pardon his children. At that point, this was as much mercy as he could hope for. Even if others had also involved themselves just as much in the scheme to get what they wanted from it, Northumberland had been chosen as the scapegoat, and as much blame as possible was heaped on him, along with what he rightfully deserved for his part. But even at this point, he thought there might be a chance of a pardon, and he asked for a learned man of the clergy to visit him, suggesting he might be considering a conversion to Catholicism. On the morning of the 21st of August on Tower Hill, the axemen and a large crowd of up to 10,000 gathered to see the Duke of Northumberland's last moments. However, an hour went by and no one appeared on the scaffold. Instead, if Jane had looked from her window, she would have seen Northumberland, along with others condemned for the crime of treason, being led into the small chapel of the tower. Within, Mass was performed, and Northumberland proclaimed to the congregation inside that Catholicism was in fact the very right and true way, and that he and others had been seduced these 16 years past by Protestantism. It made no change to his sentence, only the date. The next morning, Northumberland again went to Mass, but this time was fetched a short time after to wait his turn on the scaffold, wearing a grey-coloured cloak of damask. He mounted the steps to the scaffold and turned to face the crowd across the railing. He announced his crime and asked for forgiveness as he gave his life as the Queen had demanded. But Northumberland also made sure to state that he was not the only one who had planned to place Jane on the throne, and even suggested He was not the original schemer of the plan, but it was too late now to change fate. Kneeling on the straw and placing a blindfold over his eyes, the Duke of Northumberland lay down and was beheaded with one stroke. The large crowd gave a deafening roar of approval. Mary, at this point, was still determined to pardon Jane once her trial was over and she was no longer the gossip of the town. Jane's mother and father did their part in providing Mary with reasons to give forgiveness. They said Jane had no knowledge of the plan to usurp the throne until a later stage, which was possibly mostly true. Jane had been told by Northumberland before Edward's death that she was in line for the throne, but she hadn't necessarily understood the full truth of what that meant, or might have understood it as her sons would become heirs. Whatever the truth, her parents also added that the marriage between herself and Guildford wasn't even valid, as she had been previously promised to a low-ranking member of Bishop Gardiner's household. This would have made her safely married low enough to have been excluded from the succession, but nothing was heard of the potential groom again, and no one was much impressed by this. However, the ambassadors sent messages back to Spain stating that Mary had decided not to put Jane to death due to her family connection and her young age, and that although Mary would take the greatest possible care for the future, she would be setting Jane free. A week later, her future still up in the air, Jane met with Rowland Lee for dinner in the Tower, an official from the Royal Mint, and Nathaniel Partridge, her jailer and Lee's friend. Sat at the head of the table, Jane was cheerful and confident, raising a glass to Lee and asking him to keep his cap on, having removed it in her presence. Her imprisonment, so far away from her family or friends, meant that any interaction with others was precious to her now. During the meal, Jane proclaimed loudly that Queen Mary was a merciful princess. I beseech God she may long continue. She had no doubt heard the rumours that she was to have her life spared, and perhaps one day even be free of the Tower. But as dinner talk turned to religion, Jane also revealed she was under no illusions on what Mary's plans were, despite the current compromise of worshipping as people chose. Mary was staunchly Catholic, and she would, as soon as possible, return her kingdom to the papacy of Rome. The conversation turned angry as Northumberland's conversion was brought up, and Jane furiously stated her hatred towards him, that he had abandoned what she believed to be the true faith. In her eyes, he had risked his immortal soul, and she loudly proclaimed that she would rather die than convert, surprising the diners present with the vehemence of her words for so young an age. Soon, Jane would get her turn to publicly stand up for her faith. The 13th of November was the date of her trial, and Jane was led out of the Tower alongside Guildford and two of his brothers, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. The prisoners were led through the streets to London's Guildhall, the place for their trial. Guildford had dressed to impress in a black velvet doublet slashed with white satin, but it was Jane who stole the show as the prime prisoner. She was dressed completely in black, a sign of her regret for her crimes, her cape and French hood both trimmed in further black detailing. However, she also carried a Bible in her hands, another hanging from her waist trimmed in black velvet, both a symbol of her rebellious feelings towards the papacy creeping back into England. Reportedly, she remained, as she always seemed to in these stressful political situations, the image of cool composure, even as she was read the verdict from the judges of her trial: death, by being burned alive. But all was not yet lost. Rumours were spread that the Grey girls were actually illegitimate, as their father Henry had been betrothed to the sister of the Earl of Arundel before marrying Francis, something that would have saved them by taking them out of the line of succession. It was well known Mary's feelings were to spare her young cousin, and Jane's father threw all he had into saving his daughter. He professed undying loyalty to Mary, and even said Mary should marry whoever she wished, even Philip of Spain, Charles V's son. The idea filled even Mary's most steadfast followers with horror, as they feared England and Wales being swallowed into the juggernaut of the Habsburg Empire. When the news came out late in November that she had in fact already accepted his betrothal in a secret meeting, it was very unpopular. Unrest bubbled beneath the surface, especially amongst those who still felt deeply for Protestantism. On the 26th of November, a group of evangelicals who were close to the Grey family met to plot uprisings across the country. One of them, a man called Thomas Wyatt. He was the son of Elizabeth Brooke, a woman who had once been considered for the position as Henry VIII's sixth wife. Another of the group was Henry, Jane's father. The men planned to replace Mary with her Protestant sister Elizabeth. It was a huge risk for the safety of Jane, but if her impassioned speech to Leigh and Partridge was anything to go by, she would have been proud of her father for defending what he believed to be the true religion. Queen Mary still knew nothing about these plans when from the 18th of December, Jane was permitted by her to walk in the Queen's garden instead of being shut in her rooms, finally able to breathe in the cool, crisp winter air. Her next step was to pardon Jane and send her home to her parents, but Mary had not understood the strength of Jane's religious convictions. There would be no conversion to the return of the old faith. In fact, Jane had prepared a letter damning those who attended Mass, a letter which would be widely circulated in England and Europe. Her letter was addressed to Thomas Harding, a former tutor of the Grey sisters who had recently converted to Catholicism. In it, Jane stated, "I cannot but marvel at thee, and lament thy case," her coldly constructed words damning him for his choice, and describing him as the deformed imp of the devil. She went further, decrying all those who had accepted the crown's return to papacy rather than fighting against it. So venomous was this letter that later Victorian admirers of Jane refused to believe that such a sweet, innocent girl could have written it. Her letter proved that although Jane was only a teenager, she had an inner strength of faith that was steel-like in its intensity. She had no interest in hiding her opinions. Meanwhile, her father and the other rebels had firmed up their plans by the 22nd of December. The revolt would take place late in March. Smaller uprisings would take place across the country before the leaders converged to take London. Whether or not Jane had initially meant her letter as pertaining purely to spiritual matters, it would be taken as a proclamation to physical force. Although Jane had never sought the crown for herself, it doesn't mean she wanted Catholic Queen Mary to be ruler either, especially when her sister Elizabeth was a Protestant. One of the rebels, Sir Peter Carew, told Henry Grey he would personally lead Mary to the Tower and take Jane from it. Then Bishop Gardiner, friends with another of the rebels, Edward Courtenay, caught wind of the plot on the 21st of January. Henry's brother Thomas rode to warn him that the plan had been discovered and rumours were flying around at court. Thomas told his brother that he would surely be put back in the Tower and should start the revolt at once. Still ill and unable to think clearly, Henry agreed. Although a few abandoned the plan and fled abroad, Wyatt remained and began his part of the revolt in Kent. Henry Grey was yet to leave his home when a messenger from Queen Mary arrived. Still unaware of his role in events, Mary wanted to give him the chance to prove his loyalty to the crown by leading an army against Wyatt. Telling the messenger he was already on his way to the Queen, Henry dismissed him as quickly as he could before riding to meet with his brothers. They had no army raised, little cash upon their persons, but once they failed to arrive at court they were declared traitors. Nobles went after him, but he managed to evade capture for a while. Proclamations were sent out from his side that declared the fear that England would be handed to Spain was true, and that anyone who would oppose the marriage would be given 6 pence a day. However, the marriage contract between Mary and Philip had been published a few weeks before, stating that Philip was to have the title king, but no powers over England whatsoever. A few days later, Henry Grey was caught. But when the rebels in Kent found out, having grown in numbers, they marched into London and surrounded Bishop Gardiner's palace, setting it alight. The guard was increased around Whitehall and the Queen's chambers, and that cannons at the Tower of London were moved around to fire at rebels on the other bank of the River Thames. Wyatt moved ever closer into the royal heart of the capital, making it more dangerous for Jane. While the intention for the rebels was to crown Elizabeth, this wasn't clear to Mary, and Jane, and to a lesser degree Guildford, were both still beacons for the rebels' cause. It had become too dangerous to let them live after all, and the next day, Mary condemned them both to die. The only small mercy was that their respective sentences of being hanged, drawn and quartered or burned alive were changed to beheading. But Jane would not go out with a whimper. Knowing by now that Jane's father would soon arrive at the Tower, Guildford used an old prayer book to pass on a message to his father-in-law. He wrote, "Your loving and obedient son wisheth unto your grace long life in this world, with as much joy and comfort as I wish to myself, and in the world to come, life everlasting. Your humble son to his death, G. Dudley." Somehow, this book was then passed into Jane's hands, and she added her own message below. "The Lord comfort your grace, and that in his word wherein all creatures only are to be comforted. And though it has pleased God to take away 2 of your children, yet think not, I most humbly beseech your grace, that you have lost them, but that we, by losing this mortal life, have won an immortal life." It would appear that Jane had accepted her fate and was ready to go on into the next life as a martyr to her cause. The rebels continued pushing on to the Queen, and the executions for the 7th of February were abandoned as Mary was warned she should leave for her own safety. Queen Mary bravely refused, declaring herself mother of her people and sending her army out against the rebellion. The battle continued throughout the day, but finally, before 5 p.m, the rebels were defeated. Jane and Guildford would have heard prisoners being brought into the Tower, Thomas Wyatt chief amongst them. Mary, once again feeling safe, wavered in her decision to execute Jane and Guildford. There was no need to kill them now, but those advising her thought differently, and they convinced Mary that the deed had to be done. The warrant was signed, and the deaths of Jane and her husband were scheduled for the 9th of February. Still hopeful she could persuade Jane to convert and save herself, Mary sent her personal chaplain John Feckenham to see her cousin. He had been a prisoner himself in the Tower during Edward's reign, and was known as both merry and highly persuasive. When he arrived in Jane's room, however, she dismissed him, saying that he was too late and she had to prepare to die. Feckenham was moved, and he begged the Queen for a few extra days in order to speak more to Jane. Mary readily agreed, probably as desperate to prevent the death of her young relative, and the sentences for both Jane and Guildford were commuted to the 12th. When Feckenham returned to see Jane, he said how sorry he was to see her how she was, but Jane smoothly retorted that she saw her imprisonment as a manifest declaration of God's favour towards me, a chance to repent her sins before going on to heaven. On Jane's final night alive, she spent it writing letters to those she loved. To her father, she wrote a letter of comfort, stating that it was not by his hand that she was in the Tower, but that they had all just been doing the will of God. No letters to her mother Frances or her younger sister Mary exist, but it's possible they did exist and were later destroyed by Frances to keep her remaining daughters safe. Jane's letter to Katherine encouraged her 13-year-old sister to be a martyr for the cause of Protestantism, to take on her mantle. Reportedly, Guildford requested a final meeting with his wife, but Jane refused. She replied that meeting would only increase their misery and pain, and that it was better to wait, as they would shortly meet elsewhere and live bound by indissoluble ties. At around 10 the next morning, Jane looked from her window to see Guildford being led to the scaffold. He stopped at the main gate to ask those present to pray for him, but no priest was present as he made his way up the steps to his end. It suggests he had refused one, instead simply saying his own prayers before he laid flat on the block, the executioner removing his head cleanly with one blow. Guildford was as much a martyr as Jane, even if he was not to be as famous. His body and head were taken to the Tower's chapel as Jane emerged from Partridge's house to face her own death. She wore the same deeply black gown she had worn on the day of her trial, a prayer book open in her hands as she read to herself. 2 of her companion ladies were with her, Mistress Allen and Mistress Tilney, who wept furiously as they walked behind her. It was, after all, a tragedy. 2 young people were to be cut down before their lives had even really begun, all because of a plan orchestrated by others who were older and greedier, many of whom were now free. Climbing the same scaffold Guildford had been on just a while earlier, Jane turned to face the crowd, addressing them. "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to do the same. I do wash my hands thereof in innocence before God and the face of you, good Christian people, this day." She added, "that I die a true Christian woman, and that I look to be saved by none other means, but only by the mercy of God." Jane requested that the good people present not pray for her once she was gone, as Catholics did, but to join her in prayer while still alive. There was a flicker of uncertainty as she turned to Feckenham to ask if she could read a psalm, to which he gave his consent. She knelt to recite it, and upon standing, gave her gloves and handkerchief to her ladies. She looked down and saw the thick beam of wood that would serve as the place to put her neck, and she asked, "I pray you dispatch me quickly." Suddenly afraid this would mean the blow could come before she was ready, she added, "Will you take my head before I lay me down?" "No, madam," the executioner assured her. Jane placed a blindfold around her eyes, but then panicked as she realised she couldn't find the block without seeing it. "What shall I do? Where is it?" For a second, Jane, the confident, opinionated teenager, the brave martyr, the potential queen, was swept away as everyone saw the scared, innocent child underneath. Someone quickly helped her by guiding her to the block gently. Jane laid her head on the block and uttered her last words. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." There was a single blow of the axe, a spray of blood, and Lady Jane Grey was dead. She had been a highly intelligent and academic young girl with a world of potential ahead of her. She had also been a fearless and faithful adherent to Protestantism, becoming a martyr in the Tower that would be legendary for centuries to come. Jane had been a queen, taking on her role with composure and strength beyond her years. Jane had also been the victim of greedy nobles who saw what they wanted through using her as a pawn, a victim of her parents' desire for their eldest clever daughter to reach the highest echelons of society. But here it ended, and Lady Jane Grey would now live on only as a legend to be shaped to fit other histories. But it wasn't the end for the Grey family. They were a family in mourning, and soon Henry Grey would also lose his head. But the story wasn't over for Lady Katherine and Lady Mary. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.